terms of the influence he had on the people there, like you, following in his footsteps.
Yeah, Walter Cronkite was the reason, Campbell, that I wanted to get into the news business. And what Sam says is true. You know, when he was forced to retire at the age of 65, I think he still felt that he had a lot of strength left in him and a lot of years left in him. And I remember that he had said publicly over the years that he was kind of forced out of the business just before the real money came in, and he would have liked to have had the opportunity to stay on for a few more years. And I really agree with Sam that he probably could have done it for another 10 years. I mean, he was in his prime when he gave up that seat, and for whatever reason, right or wrong, he did accept it. He accepted it with grace, though. I think there is plenty of evidence that in the years that followed that he probably regretted the decision. But just in terms of when you look at the panorama of America and you look at the history of news in America, you had Douglas Edwards at CBS. You had Edward R. Murrow, who, of course, is somebody who created a unique niche in American news. But I just don't think that there will ever be anyone like Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite was not only a pioneer in terms of creating this format of the evening news, but he was a man whose credibility and whose generosity and whose trust in America I don't think will ever be repeated. I don't think that there will ever be another Walter Cronkite, and that's probably a good thing, because he came in at a time when America was going through a transitional phase, and he really became sort of the figurehead for so many different things in America, and I think that he will always be remembered for that. And I know for this person who started watching him from the age of 5 years old, he will forever remain an icon of journalism and sort of the pinnacle of American television journalism. I don't think that anybody could ever take on the mantle that he had.
All right, John Roberts, stay with us, and Sam Donaldson, if you guys can. Wolf Blitzer actually interviewed Walter Cronkite. This was on the beaches of Normandy. We want to take a look.
We do have a very special guest, someone who is probably best known in the United States, someone who is associated with D-Day, the entire World War II effort, and I'm talking, of course, about veteran newsman Walter Cronkite. Mr. Cronkite, thank you very much for spending a few moments with us here on CNN.
Good to be with you, Wolf.
You are going to be the master of ceremonies at this memorial service, 50th anniversary service at the cemetery here today.
Very small part, but that's what they call it.
What's your message? What do you hope will be achieved by all of these events?
Well, I think that by reviewing again, looking again at the sacrifice of young men and women today that is taken in the name of warfare, we ought to be sobered into a realization that conflict resolution is far more important than picking up arms to settle our disagreements. It's a terrible thing to think of the thousands upon thousands of young people who will never have a chance to live their lives, who will never see their own children. As Dwight Eisenhower told me, sitting on this very wall over here on the 20th anniversary of D-Day, that he thinks of the grandchildren that these young kids will never have. And that's something for all of us to think about. It's no way to settle our disagreements.
Is it your sense that this younger generation born after World War II knows what happened, or is beginning to think of it as some long forgotten past?
Well, it is a long forgotten thing for them. When I think back when I was 20 years old, or thinking back 50 years, for heaven's sakes, have been beyond the Spanish-American War, and I didn't think much of the Spanish-American War. Of course, it was a vastly different war than this one, which was a fully justified conflict in defense of liberty and attempt to win it back for peoples who'd been trammeled under the boot of that despicable Hitler. So there wasn't any disagreement about this war on the part of the American people. Very few dissenters. It was a war for a very just cause.
What goes through your minds 50 years ago today? Where were you right now?
Right now, I was back in London, but an H hour, at the moment that these guys hit the beach for the first time, at 6:30 a.m., I was about 12,000 feet overhead in a B-17 Flying Fortress.
Did you know what was going on?
Oh, yes. We knew it was D-Day by that time. I didn't know a few hours before that when an Air Force officer came by the my apartment and said, "We've got a very dangerous assignment. I can't tell you anything more about it than that, but if you want to come, here we go." And after we got into the car, he said, "This is D-Day. And the Air Force has a very late mission. The Army's asked for some close support behind the beaches from heavy bombers. We weren't trained to do that kind of mission, but a squadron from the 303rd Group, led by a then Major Lewis Lyle, came over, and I was aboard."
You had friends, acquaintances who were killed on D-Day?
Oh, quite a few, including some correspondents. Not on D-Day, but within a few days of the landing.
And so have you been thinking about them over these past few days?
Oh, you can't help but to remember those who died and went through that, suffered the ultimate sacrifice in these things. Correspondents were, not tooting my own horn at all, I had my motto was, "Let's get the devil out of here." but the guys who went in on D-Day here were a brave bunch. They knew what they were getting into. They attacking Hitler's fortress Europa, and they knew it was going to be tough on the beaches, but they came to do their job of informing the American people, and I think we should all honor them.
Now, you recently wrote an article.
Walter Cronkite there being interviewed by Wolf Blitzer. Walter Cronkite dying today. He was, of course, he took over as anchor of the CBS Evening News in 1962 until he retired and was replaced by Dan Rather. And we actually have one of his executive producers, a former executive producer, Susan Zirinsky, on the phone with us now. I believe. Susan, you there?
Yes, I am, Campbell.
Tell us what it was like to work for the man.
Well, in the day when we were all kids, and those of us who were starting under Walter embodied kind of the best of everything and the best you would aspire to. There were 3 networks at that point, and Walter was the most important man. You lived and died by what he said, how he wanted pieces to be told. You were answerable to Walter. When Walter picked up the phone, you were scared to death. But on the other hand, there was a core value in what we did. And, it was a time when one voice mattered. The world we live in now, the proliferation of news, which is great for the consumer, but it was a different time. One single man mattered above all else. And that's the dynamic of Walter. And he had this remarkable career. He himself loved every story he went on. Science, space, Russian stories. It was just inspiring to grow up under his watch, because this was the man who was inventing it. So, you felt like at the ground level. And while in today's world, it's fantastic to have this many resources, life was a bit simpler, and there were no questions about core values. Do you pay for footage? Do you pay for interviews? It was a different time and place, and those of us who were fortunate enough to work under him have that core body embodiment of him in our hearts and our brains.
What was he like as a person? Because you talk about, Susan, his enormous influence, and you would think, okay, somebody this incredible has to have an enormous ego, but what was he like as a mentor to someone like you? I mean, now you're the executive producer of 48 Hours. You were just coming up the ranks. How influential was he on you personally?
Well, I have the script that he wrote the night Nixon resigned from office, and he actually threw it away in the garbage can, and I picked it out, and I thought, oh my, this is history. I've got to keep this. I've got to hold on to this. He was about telling the story. It's about the story. It wasn't about him. It was about what we were covering. And I think that he was not afraid to take on the administration. I mean, everybody remembers when he went to Vietnam, and he came back, and Lyndon Johnson turned to his people, and he said, if we've lost Walter Cronkite, we've lost the war. And he embodied every person. He really approached news. He wasn't a trained broadcaster. He had been a print reporter, but he wasn't trained in broadcasting. But he knew the power of the written word, and he really transferred it to the visual medium. He saw the impact when he went to Vietnam. He saw the impact on space. I think part of the joy of working with Walter, and for those of us that are still around, is that every single day was kind of an adventure. Every day he wanted to break something, to show something. And if somebody else broke something, it was like power to the people. He picked up the phone. It was a very exciting time. And, you know, quite frankly, the basis of what you do, what people in cable and in network television do, we all came out of the Walter Cronkite School, whether you know it or not. The power of that single person, of that single heart of news value is what we all grow up with. You know, some people may get diverted on the course, but when it comes to the end of the day, Walter's voice is kind of rings loud and clear here at CBS even today.
And Susan, there was also this incredible love story between he and his wife. Tell us a little bit about that.
You know, there was a very late birthday party, and George Clooney was there for him, and it was a big audience, and they asked him, of all the people you've met, who is the most important person in your life that you have met? And he said, I'd have to say my wife, Betsy. You know, that's pretty blowaway for a guy that brought Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin together for the Mideast peace talks. There was this was what Walter was. He had this dynamic life. He met every world leader, but the core of Betsy and the family and the kids, he knew. He took time with them. You know, he went away for his vacations. He took those vacations, and it really made him a more interesting and grounded person. He was not blinded by the lights. He really saw the value in family, and Betsy was his rock.
And Susan, you know, you talked about when he did speak out about an issue, the power it had, that you know, how much it conveyed, because he so rarely did. And even after he left the air, he did speak out against the war in Iraq, though. He said it had reminded him of Vietnam. Was that ever a struggle for him as an anchor? You know, the objectivity, and it's far different today, as you know, in cable news, full of opinion. But he completely set a different standard.
You know, I think he understood the power and the growing power of the medium. You know, Edward R. Murrow talked about lights in a box and wires in a box and the power of it. Walter was the next generation, and, you know, the increasing power during Watergate. You know, Walter would come down to Washington to do all these specials that were breaking on a daily basis. The press during that era in the 70s and until Nixon resigned, you know, the power of the press was pretty remarkable. Vietnam was pretty remarkable. You know, you were holding people accountable, and for Walter, that was the penultimate. That was the deepest value of what a journalist could do. It could shed light. He wasn't there with an agenda. He was there with an honest take of what he saw the situation and thought it was his duty to bring it to the American people. That is the value of a Walter Cronkite. And, you know, after he left being the anchor, he did feel that he had influence. He really did understand the value of the power of a journalist and the observation. You know, we're observers. That's what we're trained to do. We're supposed to shed light. There's just a lot more flashlights out there now, and sometimes, just sometimes, it's harder to have a unique voice. The cacophony of the world that you and I inhabit to this day is so loud that to have that dramatic impact is harder today. It's the nature of the beast.
Susan, it was this week that he announced a man has made it to the moon. Let's listen to that.
Roger, tranquility. We copy on the ground.
Oh, boy. What?
Okay, we're going to be busy for a minute.
When that vehicle landed on the moon, I was speechless. I really couldn't say a thing.
You know, Susan, and John Roberts is still with us as well. I want to get both of your reaction to that, because you just look at his face, the joy and excitement of witnessing that moment. And of course, the space shuttle takes off all the time now. We take it for granted, and that was such an extraordinary thing. He was very passionate about covering those events, wasn't he?
There was that scene, you know, when they landed, and he was kind of speechless, and he was wringing his hands, and, you know, it was joy. But, you know, Walter saw the space program as something else also. Walter saw the space program as the embodiment of a country that needed something to hold on to. And so it became not just about the space program, but it was about the power of the American spirit. And he saw it, and he got it, and he felt it, but then he brought it forth and just shared it. You know how when somebody walks in, they're so excited. Well, when Walter Cronkite went on the air on space, you couldn't help but feel that joy.
Why they did it. And then,
right.
Then there came a time when the news was not only widely watched, but very profitable for CBS and the other networks. And he had millions and millions of people tuning in just to watch him and to hear how he saw the world.
That's right. You are so right. You're a good student of the industry. That's exactly what happened. When in the early days, news was just considered to be this little public service thing and just a little filler, and the networks tolerated it. But as news tried to grow, one of the ways that news succeeded in growing was actually covering the conventions. And the conventions in those early days were so exciting because it wasn't a coronation the way it is now. You really didn't know who was going to be the nominee. So once the news divisions of each network, and that was really primarily NBC and CBS, ABC was just emerging, then they were able to take advantage of the excitement and the drama that would occur at the convention. And then as they began to capture audiences, then news became a real viable programming tool for the network. And then when 60 Minutes was created, which preceded Walter's See It Now, and Walter preceded all of this, See It Now, Person to Person with Edward R. Murrow, then it really became a profitable center. You know, one of the things, John, at CBS that was unique was that it was run by a man named William Paley. And he considered CBS to be such an autonomous part of the company. It didn't matter to him if it was profitable. He felt this incredible, strong feeling that he was doing a public service, and even if he spent tons of money and that the company didn't make any money from the news division, it was something that he felt was very close to his heart. So CBS was able to thrive, actually, for many years without looking at the bottom line. And Walter was all part of that. I mean, he was really CBS News. He was the face of CBS News, the heartbeat of CBS News. And we all idolized him. I mean, I certainly did. Mm-hmm. I would call him for advice all the time. And he always had a minute, you know, he was always happy to be there for all of us. He was not someone who just was friendly and nice. He was a tough editor. You know, he was one of the first anchors to acquire the title of managing editor. And he was a serious editor. He looked at our reports when I was a correspondent, and he would edit them. And when I had a report on the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite, he'd call down and say, "Look, I don't think you can say this. Why don't you explain to me why you think you can say this?" And I'd be shaking in my boots.
Oh, I'll bet.
Yeah.
Also the first anchor to be called an anchor.
Yes, can you imagine? It was coined because of Walter. I mean, I'm astounded when I think back about that. And even, I'll tell you, as far as I was concerned, he was the only anchor man. You know, everyone, we were all, those of us who followed were pretenders to the throne compared to Walter. He's just, even in later years, we'd see him at social gatherings and, parties, cocktail parties and everything, and he was so the same. I can tell you he was, still had that strong voice and that clipped way of speaking. He was always really quite sharp. I mean, I was a bit shocked because I hadn't seen him lately, hadn't been in touch with him lately, and I'm just, I can't tell you how sad I am, because it's really it's the end of an era that I don't know. I don't think, unfortunately, news is the same without Walter.
Yeah.
Hasn't been the same since he left. And, you know, it was very, very straight. But anyway, he was a wonderful, wonderful man.
So many of us feel the same way. Connie Chung, who spent her own time as anchor of the CBS Evening News. Connie, thank you. A Fox News alert. Walter Cronkite, the anchorman, the first person in television history to take that title. Walter Cronkite has died at the age of 92. To those of us of a certain age, it seemed like Walter Cronkite was television news for so many generations. It seems hard to believe that it's been 28 years, more than 28 years, in fact, since he signed off his last broadcast as anchor of the CBS Evening News. Of course, he made a number of appearances on CBS and other public television and so forth, other outlets in the years since he last signed off on that broadcast. Walter Cronkite left the air in 1981 when he was the #1, the most popular anchor in television. Let's continue our look back at his career with Bret Baier, special report anchor here on Fox News Channel. Brit Hume, senior political analyst, is also with us. Again, Bret, just the inspiration that this man gave to so many of us. I mean, I was in my first television news reporting job when Walter Cronkite signed off, and I remember watching that night and thinking, wow, this is really the end of an era.
Yeah, and you know, I met him once and made a point at an event to walk over and introduce myself, and he was the father of television news. You know, you see these quotes from the CBS folks, 60 Minutes correspondent Morley Safer, saying that the trust that viewers placed in him was based on the recognition of his fairness, honesty, and strict objectivity, and of course his long experience as a shoe leather reporter covering everything from local politics to World War II and its aftermath in the Soviet Union. And this is the line: he was a giant of journalism and privately one of the funniest, happiest men I've ever known. You talk to the folks at CBS who worked alongside of him, and that's the sense that you get about Walter Cronkite, that not only did he exude this objectivity and this fascination to go after the facts and a love of news, but also had this ability to come off as a friendly, happy person to work alongside. I've talked to a number of folks at CBS who paint a very similar picture, and for somebody who aspired to be in the anchor chair, I always thought he was the anchor, the first one, really. And quickly, as we've talked about this on the eve of the 40th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing, we've talked about how Walter Cronkite was so fascinated with the space program. He said in an interview in '96 that he was really speechless when the Apollo 11 landed, you know, with that, he said, gosh, wow, gee, on the air. And this is the quote he had. He said, "I had as much time to prepare for that moon landing as NASA did, and I still was speechless when it happened. It was just so awe-inspiring to actually be able to see the thing through the television. That was a miracle in itself." And you heard Connie Chung say that his advice to her was just be yourself. And I think that really was Walter Cronkite.
That's for sure. Brit Hume is also with us, our senior political analyst. Brit, he was quite a science buff. Do you have a comet? I'm sorry, it is a comet, I believe. No, asteroid. Do you have an asteroid named after you? There's an asteroid flying out there in space, 6318 Cronkite.
No, I don't, John, and I don't anticipate I ever will. I was just thinking as we were watching these pictures of Walter Cronkite over the length of his career and sensing the variety of stories that he covered and people that he knew and things that he did. You see the geniality in the man, and you see the sort of the sweetness in his face. And,
yes.
And that is one of the things we remember most about him. But you know, he was called an anchor man, and he was the first anchor of the first evening newscast, I guess, really, as we knew it in those days. But it was quite a while before he became #1. We've noted repeatedly, you know, that the Huntley Brentford report, which was tremendous success, remained number one for a number of years after Walter Cronkite took over as the anchor, was the anchor at CBS. What finally, I think, happened is that CBS assembled behind Cronkite a tremendous team of star correspondents. And you may recall, John, at the beginning of that newscast, they would often tick off a list of the correspondents you're going to see that night. And it would be Dan Rather at the White House.
Britt, I hate to cut you off, but they're giving me the wrap. We'll be right back in a Fox News alert. If you're just joining us, Walter Cronkite has passed away, the legendary newsman, the first anchor, the first person to earn that term in the television news business. Walter Cronkite has passed away at the age of 92. I want to get back to our conversation with our Washington senior political analyst, Britt Hume. Britt, I hate to have interrupted the story you were telling for the commercial break, but that's the way things go in this business.
I get it, John. Not at all. I run into a heartbreaker too myself. We were just talking about the moment when Cronkite ascended finally after some years of quite stiff competition with the Huntley-Brinkley report, which was #1 in news for a number of years, to first place in the evening news ratings. And CBS had really put an amazing team together behind Cronkite. And they would reel off the names at the top of the CBS evening news. I'm sure you remember this. They'd come on, they'd tell you who was going to be on. And it would be Dan Rather at the White House, Roger Mudd on Capitol Hill, Marvin Kalb at the State Department, and covering the war in Vietnam when it was going, it was people like Morley Safer, Bernard Kalb, Bob Schieffer was there covering the Pentagon. These are names, that all of us have known over the years. Very famous correspondents in their own right. And then there would be Eric Severine's analysis. Of course, he developed that form of the short, straight-to-camera analytical piece. And one of the reasons he was never attacked, Severine was never attacked by the critics of the media during the Nixon administration was that the people in the Nixon White House thought Severine looked a little bit like what people thought God looked like. So it was quite a team they put together behind Cronkite, and I think that, and Cronkite, of course, was open to all of that. Liked reporters, liked correspondents, honored correspondents, treated them well, and you could sense the rapport on the air, and it made for a very powerful combination.
He is just such a part of the fabric of America's, really last half century or so. I want to read a statement from President George W. Bush, former President George W. Bush. His office released this statement upon the death of Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite was an icon of American journalism who shaped his profession in countless ways during his decades on the air. Tonight, his family is in our thoughts and prayers. This is a guy, Britt, who left college even before graduation, dropped out because he just had the bug, had the itch, and at age 19 dropped out of college, at which he was pursuing a journalism degree, but dropped out so that he could get out there in the field and start reporting.
Yeah, and I've always believed that if you could get a job as a reporter, if you're going to be a reporter, there was no training like that and no education like that. And Cronkite was certainly an example of that. It's been mentioned that he was on the air. What was it, 24 hours straight or whatever? He had a nickname. They called him Iron Pants.
Right.
Because he could hold the air for hours on end, and he never seemed to get tired. And I remember so vividly, John. It was 1970, July 4th, 1976, the bicentennial of this country. And Cronkite had been on the air. I was in the ABC News Washington Bureau as a correspondent, and we had all the network shows up on us. We were doing what we were doing, and Cronkite had been on the air all day long. And they finally took a break at 11 o'clock at night for local news. And I thought, well, that's probably the last we're going to see of Cronkite. He's been there forever. And at 11:30, here he comes back again. And I'm thinking, the poor guy must be exhausted. He comes on the air. He's full of excitement. He says, what a day, what a day, what a day this has been. And then he starts this recap of the days. I was astonished that after all those hours that the guy still had energy and enthusiasm. And so they didn't call him Iron Pants for nothing.
That's for sure. We understand there is a statement out now from President Obama. Let's go to Brett Baer in Washington for that. Brett?
John, the White House has just released a statement, and here it is. Quote, "For decades, Walter Cronkite was the most trusted voice in America. His rich baritone reached millions of living rooms every night, and in an industry of icons, Walter set the standard by which all others have been judged. He was there through wars and riots, marches and milestones, calmly telling us what we needed to know. And through it all, he never lost the integrity he gained growing up in the heartland. But Walter was always more than just an anchor. He was someone we could trust to guide us through the most important issues of the day, a voice of certainty in an uncertain world. He was family. He invited us to believe in him, and he never let us down. This country has lost an icon and a dear friend, and he will be truly missed." That's President Obama's statement released by the White House just a few moments ago.
Brett Baer, thank you. Rita Braver is CBS News National.
11:35 on Cleveland CBS 19.
Good morning. Charles Osgood is off today. I'm Anthony Mason, and this is Sunday Morning. If our greeting seems a little muted this morning, it's because all of us here at CBS News are still mourning the loss of Walter Cronkite, who died Friday night at the age of 92. For millions of American families in the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s, watching Walter Cronkite and the CBS Evening News was a nightly ritual. That's the way it was back then. Martha Teichner will report our cover story.
The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m.
It's hard to remember the assassination of President Kennedy without remembering the way Walter Cronkite reported it.
Man on the way to the moon.
Or the first man on the moon.
Boy. Good evening from the CBS News Control Center in New
There's
York.
a reason why he was considered the most trusted man in America. Our tribute to Walter Cronkite this Sunday morning.
No account of Walter Cronkite's life and times would be complete without hearing him tell the story in his own words. Fortunately, Walter did just that a few years ago in a talk with our own Charles Osgood.
Although he was once told that he didn't have the voice to make it as a big league broadcaster, Walter Cronkite had a career any journalist might envy. But there was a time when the most trusted man in America could have pursued a very different vocation.
Your dad was a dentist.
My dad was a dentist. My grandfather was a dentist. My uncle was a dentist.
And you decided to be the first in a long line of dentists to do something else.
Yeah. I thought I'd rather look in the horse's mouth and get the truth rather than people's mouths.
Later on Sunday morning, Walter Cronkite, straight from the horse's mouth.
By his own estimation, the biggest story Walter Cronkite ever covered was the one small step astronaut Neil Armstrong took 40 years ago tomorrow as part of an unprecedented mission.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour.
They were 8 days in July that were truly out of this world.
This is the flight from which man will first set foot on the moon.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
And no one was more dazzled than Walter Cronkite, our tour guide for man's first steps on the moon.
Well, one small step for man, but I didn't get the second phrase.
Coming up, one small step, one stellar event.
Beautiful, just beautiful.
Nearly everyone knows about Walter Cronkite's spirited coverage of space exploration. Fewer know that it was because of Cronkite that America first came to meet the Beatles. Katie Couric will tell the story of John, Paul, George, Ringo, and Walter.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles.
Close your eyes.
Most people think the Beatles made their American television debut on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964.
The Beatles were on American television for the first time, not, as history seems to have it recorded, on the Ed Sullivan Show, but on the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. If there's some credit in history for that, I want it.
Beatlemania and Walter Cronkite later on Sunday morning.
Mark Strassman will tell us what's next for the manned space program Walter Cronkite loved so much. We'll be hearing from many of his colleagues and contemporaries, from Morley Safer to actor George Clooney to Ted Koppel, who explains how Cronkite came to be America's town crier. President Obama, among others, will share his thoughts about the end of a broadcasting era, and more. First, here are the headlines for Sunday morning, the 19th of July, 2009. Just heard tomorrow is the 40th anniversary of mankind's great step.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first persons to set foot on the moon. Armstrong, Aldrin, and their Apollo 11 crewmate Michael Collins will be honored by President Obama tomorrow at the White House. High above the earth yesterday, a special tribute to Walter Cronkite.
We did want to salute Mr. Cronkite and offer our best wishes and condolences to his family.
Technicians at NASA Mission Control watched as astronauts aboard the International Space Station paused at the start of their spacewalk to salute our former colleague. The commander of the shuttle Endeavour, Mark Polanski, said Cronkite's reports on the space program inspired him to become an astronaut.
Good evening from the CBS News Control Center in New York.
Coming up.
And that's the way it is.
And that's the way it is.
That's the way it is. And that's the way it is.
A portrait of the anchorman. He was the broadcaster for whom the word anchorman was coined. Veteran CBS newsman Walter Cronkite died Friday evening at the age of 92. Walter Cronkite played a role in our national life like no other broadcast journalist, and all the rest of us are still following in his footsteps. Martha Teichner offers this appreciation.
Good evening from the CBS News Control Center in New York. This is Walter Cronkite reporting.
Great Ohio River system is out of its banks from Pennsylvania to Illinois. And
For nearly 20 years, one man told Americans that's the way it is.
And that's the way it is.
That's the way it is. And that's the way it is. And that's the way it is.
And they believed him.
Supreme Court today legalized abortion.
A flurry of activity at the Jack Ruby trial.
The risk of a meltdown at the 3 Mile Island atomic power plant.
One of Cronkite's earliest producers, Don Hewitt, creator of 60 Minutes.
What made Walter Cronkite Walter Cronkite? I can no more tell you that than I can tell you made Spencer Tracy, or Cary Grant, Cary Grant.
Years before there was such a thing as a TV anchorman, while Cronkite was still a combat reporter in World War II, working for a wire service, it was already clear he had something.
I'm just back from the biggest assignment that any American reporter could have so far in this war.
This is from an old movie newsreel.
By American troops.
It was my first time on camera. I just fell into whatever it is I do naturally. I never took any elocution lessons, no diction lessons. I might have been a pretty decent broadcaster if I had. But what you see, I'm afraid, is what you get.
Hello, everyone. Here we are again in Studio A, our CBS television control point.
What Edward R. Murrow got in 1950 when he asked Cronkite to work for CBS News was a first-rate reporter, a newspaper man with some radio experience, just as television news
Good evening, everyone. Here is the news.
was being born.
The really good people that we have didn't want to do television.
Radio was still dominant then.
They actually felt that it was below them. There was some kind of show business, which it was, and is, but they weren't going to play the game at all. And then they found out that it was important, that it had an impact beyond what they had expected. And
Cronkite with Charles Osgood on Sunday morning in 1997.
But by that time, I'd gotten myself fully nailed down in television. They didn't have a chance. Not because I was better, but because I was there.
Cronkite was always there, wherever the biggest story in the world happened to be. And like a father or uncle, seemed to be there for us.
Here is a bulletin from CBS News. There has been an attempt, as perhaps you know now, on the life of President Kennedy. He was wounded in an...
It was how he told people what happened on November 22nd, 1963.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital.
For a flicker of a moment that day, viewers glimpsed the man, as well as the consummate journalist, and sensed they could trust Walter Cronkite to tell them bad news.
The investigation...
Former CBS News anchor Dan Rather covered the Kennedy assassination in Dallas.
And I think that the day President Kennedy died was the day that television news, as we now know it, was born for all intents and purposes. And Walter Cronkite was a very important part of making it so.
The day of ultimate mourning as the body of the late President John Fitzgerald Kennedy is laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery.
And it was an establishing moment.
Charles Gibson anchors ABC's World News Tonight.
In that it established that when momentous events occur and the country is deeply shaken, they gather at the television set. That is sort of the national meeting place.
The finality of it overwhelmed me. This said, it's all true. It had happened, it was over, it was done. And we were about to bury it, bury something of our past along with that man. John, salute him. Tough day. Anchormen shouldn't cry.
And he never did on the air.
Good evening from Paris, reporting from Moscow, from the Great Wall of China.
The dignity and composure he brought to his job, the gift of plain speaking, his honesty, eventually gave Walter Cronkite the power to change history.
I went to Vietnam for the first time in 1965, and I flew with the B-57s on an operation.
1, 2, 3, 4, we dropped our bombs, and now a tremendous G-load as we pull out of the dive. Wow. Well, Colonel, it's a great way to go to war.
In the early stages of our involvement in Vietnam, basically, I felt that our course was right. My concern grew with the concern of the American people.
Hell no, we won't go!
Here's, for example, remarks by Cronkite before the Houston World Affairs Council in January of '65.
Cronkite's personal papers, which he gave to the University of Texas, make clear just how quickly his concern took shape.
He's not doing this on television, but here he's calling Vietnam a seemingly bottomless pit, the insoluble quandary of Vietnam.
Historian and CBS News consultant Douglas Brinkley is writing a biography of Walter Cronkite.
I don't want to make him seem as if, in '65 he was an anti-war person per se, but this is a public remark, and he's saying this is an insoluble quandary.
He went back to Vietnam in 1968 after the Tet Offensive.
These are the kind of reporter notebooks he kept. This one's Vietnam Tet Offensive, and he puts his source always sources exactly where he's getting his information from, and he would just turn and look how neat.
It's meticulous.
Yes.
Cronkite, the meticulous reporter, came home convinced the war was unwinnable, and said so.
I simply told people what I thought about the state of the war in Vietnam, and it was that we better get out of it.
It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
And Lyndon Johnson was sitting at a television set that night and said, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the American people.
And Johnson kind of melted in sorrow when this happened and realized that his presidency had failed and that Cronkite had called him out.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Good evening.
1968. The American people got a lot of bad news that year, and Walter Cronkite broke it to them.
Good evening.
Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
My thanks to all of... Then Robert Kennedy was shot.
At the age of 42, Robert Francis Kennedy was dead.
As there is this display of enthusiasm here in the hall, there has been a display of naked violence.
At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago that summer,
Chicago police are coming in.
all hell broke loose.
You take your hands off of me unless you plan to arrest me.
And Walter Cronkite let his anger show.
Well, Walter, as you can see, I think we've got a bunch of thugs here, Dan.
I lost my temper at that moment. Sometimes I think it's perfectly legitimate for an anchor person or a news person on the air to let people know he's got a few feelings of his own.
That's it, Apollo 11, the beginning of man's greatest adventure.
It was his euphoria Cronkite let show the following year.
What a moment. Man on the way to the moon.
When the Apollo 11 astronauts went to the moon.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Oh, boy.
We're going to be busy.
Neil Armstrong.
It's impossible to think of NASA and the space program without thinking of Walter Cronkite.
I think that our conquest of space, as it were, is one of the great stories of the 20th century. And it did become, I'm happy to say, my story.
This aircraft is executing a maneuver to make it and everyone in it temporarily weightless.
Was it disappointing to you that you never actually got to go to space?
The greatest disappointment in my life. The greatest disappointment in my life.
This is what Cronkite said at the age of 80.
If they offered me a chance to go tomorrow, if I thought I could pass the physical, I'd go. But I'd still see the opportunity as a glass half empty. I wasn't getting to go to the moon.
In just about every other way, his life was a glass filled to the brim. When he wasn't doing the work he loved, he was sailing. He adored his wife of 65 years from the moment he laid eyes on her in 1936 at a radio station in Kansas City.
Her name was Dee Maxwell. I was, for some strange reason, rather shy about meeting her. And the two of us were suddenly cast in a commercial. The producer said, "Your girl, your boy, here, let's go." And the announcer said, "A scene on 12th and Walnut in Kansas City." And I say, "Well, hello, angel, what heaven did you drop from?" "Girl, I'm no angel. Boy, you look like an angel. Girl, that's because I use Richard Hudnut Cosmetics." The spark took. We went together for several years and finally married in 1940.
Betsy Cronkite died in 2005.
Now listen, everybody, don't get nervous, for heaven's sake.
For 15 of the 19 years Walter Cronkite anchored the CBS Evening News, he demolished the competition in the ratings. In poll after poll, he was voted the most trusted man in America. There were even that he run for president. Cronkite said it wouldn't be appropriate.
We're rolling.
This is my last broadcast as the anchorman of the CBS Evening News.
Walter Cronkite was so much more than what we think of today as an anchorman. It seemed inconceivable that he would ever retire, but he did in 1981.
Good night.
60 Minutes correspondent Morley Safer.
I had dinner with him that night, and he said, "I think maybe I'm making a terrible mistake."
Or maybe not. He left on a high, just as the snug three-network realm he presided over was beginning to fracture into the multiple choice mayhem television news has become.
This country has lost an icon and a dear friend, and he will be truly missed.
At some level, Cronkite had to have understood the uniqueness of his legacy. He saved everything.
Look over here. I mean, we have to get them shipped in from a warehouse.
This is only a few
it's tip of the, not beyond tip of the iceberg.
This isn't all
of the tip of the iceberg. It's box after box after box. And what's been, you asked what surprised me the most is just how much Cronkiteana there is.
This letter says it all.
Dear Walter.
It's from the late Lady Bird Johnson, wife of the president Cronkite helped to bring down.
I believe I can say in all certainty, you are a national hero. You are unabashedly one of mine.
It's hard to imagine that any one man could ever speak for the nation now. The fact that Walter Cronkite did is truly remarkable.
This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
At first, it was called the Watergate Caper.
Ahead,
5 men.
Walter Cronkite.
Who ordered the wiretaps?
Watergate and a White House under siege.
From CBS News headquarters in Washington, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
And now a page from our Sunday morning almanac, July 19th, 1974, 35 years ago today. Another chapter in the long, tangled tale of Watergate.
Good evening. The Democratic counsel for the House Judiciary Committee, John Doerr, said today the evidence warrants the impeachment of President Nixon.
The Watergate scandal was building rapidly towards its climax, and Walter Cronkite was reporting the developments of the day as even-handedly as ever.
And there was swift White House reaction. The impeachment inquiry the White House declared is a one-sided kangaroo court.
Cronkite and his CBS News colleagues had been covering the 1972 Watergate break-in and its aftermath for more than 2 years by then.
No longer a caper, but the Watergate affair.
In October of '72, Cronkite made television news history by devoting major parts of 2 evening broadcasts to extended reports on Watergate.
Who ordered the wiretaps?
Including large-scale graphics to trace the scandal in all its complicated elements.
How was the information used?
Cronkite continued to report every twist and turn of the case.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Right up to President Nixon's departure from office on August 9th of 1974.
Our long national nightmare is over, Mr. Ford said.
In retrospect, the edition of the CBS Evening News Walter Cronkite anchored 35 years ago today was nothing extraordinary, just typical of the job he did in the anchor chair every day for 19 years.
And that's the way it is. Friday, July 19th, 1974. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News, reporting from Washington. Good night.
Beautiful, just beautiful.
Just ahead, the men on the moon.
There it is, a U.S. flag on the surface of the moon.
Boy.
And the man over the moon. As you've heard of all the stories Walter Cronkite covered in his years here at CBS News, none was closer to his heart than America's manned space program. That great adventure peaked 40 years ago tomorrow with one small step by astronaut Neil Armstrong, the step that brought the very first man to the surface of the moon. We take a few moments now to revisit the remarkable days and amazing images of the mission of Apollo 11.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
CBS News presents Man on the Moon, the epic journey of Apollo 11. Here from CBS News Apollo headquarters at Kennedy Space Center, correspondent Walter Cronkite.
Good morning. It's T-minus 1 hour, 29 minutes, and 53 seconds and counting in just an hour and a half. If all goes well, Apollo 11 astronauts, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins are to lift off from pad 39A out there on the voyage man always has dreamed about. Next stop for them, the moon.
10, 9, ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Oh boy, it looks good, Wally. Building shaking. We're getting that buffeting we've become used to. What a moment. Man on the way to the moon. So we've seen another beautiful Saturn launch, but this one will never be known in history or by those of us who watched it as just another Saturn V launch. Not if all goes well, because this is the flight from which man will first set foot on the moon. We almost glibly toss that line away now, man on the moon, but by golly, just think it over.
Hey, that's a great shot right there. We see you in there. Guess that's Neil and Mike.
At this point, they were 203,000 miles from the Earth.
Hello there, Earthling. Hello there. 11, Houston, if that's not the Earth, we're in trouble.
4 days after launch, July 20th, 1969, the Apollo 11 command ship Columbia was orbiting the moon with Michael Collins at the helm, while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin began their descent in the lunar module.
Apollo 11, everything going well for a landing on the moon 3 hours, 21 minutes, and 14 seconds from now.
Houston, Eagle is ready to copy. Houston, you're a go for landing, over.
Oh, great go. One of the better goes I've heard in a long time.
Boy, we're go for landing on the moon. Woo.
30 seconds forward. Hey. Contact light. Engine arm on.
We're home.
Man on the moon.
Houston,
oh, jeez.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Ooh. Oh, boy.
Thank you.
Boy.
Okay, we're going to be busy for a minute.
There's that foot coming down.
There he is. There's a foot coming down the steps. Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon on this July 20th, 1969.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
No, one small step for man, but I didn't get the second phrase. His quote was, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
There you go.
Welcome home.
And now we have 2 Americans on the moon.
Beautiful, beautiful. Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation.
They're taking the cover off of the stainless steel plaque. Mounted on one leg there.
If you haven't read the plaque, we'll read the plaque that's on the front landing gear of this lamb. It says, "Dear men from the planet Earth, first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. It came in peace for all mankind."
There it is, a U.S. flag on the surface of the moon.
Yes, indeed.
Beautiful, just beautiful.
That flag is on a frame. There is no wind to hold it out like that, of course. It's a 3x5 flag, and it's got a frame of its own to hold it out.
Neil and Buzz, the President of the United States is in his office now and would like to say a few words to you. Over. Go ahead, Mr. President. This is Houston out.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world.
Thank you, Mr. President.
The first tourists on the moon. From their description, it sounds like someplace we might want to go after all. Aldrin called it magnificent desolation. Armstrong, stark beauty all its own. Well, for thousands of years now, it's been man's dream to walk on the moon. Right now, after seeing it happen, knowing that it happened, it still seems like a dream. And it is, I guess, a dream come true.
Their lunar explorations completed, Astronauts Armstrong and Aldrin were ready for potentially the most hazardous part of their voyage, the ascent from the moon's surface back to the orbiting Columbia spacecraft.
Man has landed on the moon. Today, the second half of the mission begins. Return him safely. This engine, the lunar module ascent engine, been fired. It's a 3,500-pound thrust engine. It gets its first test, and it's got to work today if Armstrong and Aldrin are to return home safely.
Proceed. Beautiful. 26, 36 feet per second up. 5 for the pitch over.
Engine firing, they're on the way.
1,000 feet high, 80 feet per second vertical rise.
Oh boy. Diggity dog, huh?
Off and running now.
Yes, sir. Not much that can go wrong now. On the way home, splashdown is the next big event, and that comes Thursday shortly after noon. There's not much that can go wrong now. On the way home, splashdown is the next big event, and that comes Thursday shortly after noon. They've got a visual contract from Orion 3. They're seeing this glowing re-entry like a comet coming back to the Earth's atmosphere.
They're back from the moon.
Oh,
Astronauts Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins landing in the Pacific Ocean, southwest of Hawaii.
Apollo 11 is back from the moon, safe and sound. The crew is just reported to Air Boss as they rest in their command module there on the surface of the Pacific that they're in fine shape. Aboard the aircraft carrier Hornet, President Nixon was waiting to greet the returned astronauts. Man's dream and a nation's pledge have now been fulfilled. The lunar age has begun. We may hope, but we should not believe in the excitement of today that the next trip or the ones to follow are going to be particularly easy. But we have begun with a small step for man, a giant leap for mankind, in Armstrong's unforgettable words. The date's now indelible. It's going to be remembered as long as man survives. July 20th, 1969, the day man reached and walked on the moon. The least of us is improved by the things done by the best of us, because if we are not able to land, at least we are able to follow. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins are the best of us, and they've led us further and higher than we ever imagined we were likely to go.
I'd like you to meet someone.
Next, remember this.
Mary Richards, Walter Cronkite.
So nice to meet you. Really nice. Nice. Really.
Baxter, Walter Cronkite.
It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Cronkite.
Call me Walter.
It's Sunday morning on CBS, and here again is Anthony Mason.
It's a bit of television sitcom history. Walter Cronkite's guest appearance as himself on the highly rated Mary Tyler Moore Show back in 1974. Some observations on the man and his reputation now from former ABC Nightline anchor Ted Koppel.
I heard this story from a CBS producer who claims to have witnessed it. Walter and Betsy, his wife of many years, had just taken their seats aboard a commercial airliner. The flight attendant came over and asked Walter what his name was. Cronkite, he said, with that little smile of his that was also meant to convey, look, you're going to feel a little silly in a moment when it hits you. Cronkite, the flight attendant repeated. Can you spell that for me? Walter turned to Betsy and said, you're just loving this, aren't you? Betsy probably put the flight attendant up to it in the first place. The fact is that there was a time when nobody in this country didn't know who Walter Cronkite was. He was our national town crier, the 20th century equivalent of the fellow in medieval times who walked the streets and yelled, 7 o'clock and all's well, or who explained what had gone wrong if all wasn't well. What's more, you had the feeling that absent television or radio, Walter would have been perfectly happy distributing the news door to door. Walter Cronkite was the man for whom the term anchor was created. Really. It was during the run-up to the political conventions in 1952, and there's some debate over who gets the credit, someone on the production team decided that there had to be a title to describe the fellow sitting at the desk, pulling it all together, holding it all in place. And isn't that, after all, what Walter did all those years? Pulled it all together, held it all in place? Walter Cronkite, America's anchor. And that's the way it was.
Next, the Beatles are coming.
This portion of Sunday Morning is sponsored by Audi, Truth in Engineering.
Broadcaster, an American icon. CBS mourns the loss of Walter Cronkite. A broadcasting legend, an American icon. The biggest names in politics, news, and entertainment. Remembering Walter Cronkite tonight.
Most people probably think that the Beatles had their American TV debut on The Ed Sullivan Show in early 1964. But CBS Evening News anchor Katie Couric wants you to know that they actually appeared a couple of months earlier on Walter Cronkite's news broadcast of record.
Beatlemania was well underway in the UK.
We were offered a piece by a London bureau of this phenomenon, so we put it on the air one night.
That night was December 10th, 1963.
And meanwhile, the fan mail keeps rolling in, and so does the money.
They have sold 2.5 million records. They lead the hit parade.
What has occurred to you as to why you've succeeded?
I don't know, really. You know, as you say, the haircuts.
Despite the hysteria of their mostly female fans, it wasn't clear then just how long the Beatles' success would last.
Do you have any fears that your public eventually will get tired of you and move on to a new favorite?
Well, they probably will, but, you know.
You ever think about it?
Depends how long it takes for them to get tired.
Ed Sullivan was watching that story, and right after the newscast, he called Walter Cronkite.
We were good friends, and Ed said, Walter, tell me about those kids. Tell me about those kids. What kids, Ed? You know, those kids you just had on the air. What do you call them, the Buggers or the Beatles or something?
Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles.
Close your eyes and I'll kiss you.
That performance came 2 months after their debut on the CBS Evening News.
There's some credit in history for that. I want it. We were invited backstage for that first appearance, and they were to take my 2 teenage daughters.
The Beatles were everything. They were everything for girls my age at that time. And to be able to even just see them perform, much less meet them, was outrageous.
I don't think up to that time they really cared very much what their father did, but I suddenly was a hero in their eyes.
And I'll send all my loving to you. I'll pretend that I'm kissing.
Coming up, the end of an era.
His authority and his calmness held the nation together. Not forget CBS News. He held the nation together during critical times.
Saw on TV matched the real Walter Cronkite, who lived and worked off camera. Early show anchor Maggie Rodriguez talked about that with the man who currently runs Sony, but not all that long ago was president of CBS News, Sir Howard Stringer.
Define Walter Cronkite.
Well, I think a man completely at peace with himself and comfortable in his own skin. Cary Grant once said, "I wish I'd been Cary Grant." Walter Cronkite would never have said that. Walter was always Walter Cronkite. Comfortable with himself, no inner turmoil, very, very good at what he did, and he made it look deceptively easy, which is what the great ones do. When I was on the road with him, we always looked forward to the evening, because you could have a better time with Walter Cronkite than virtually anybody. You could go sit in a restaurant and drink a glass of wine with him into the small hours, and he was as much fun as you could imagine. No artifice, just I'm Walter Cronkite and I'm having fun.
How big of an era was the Walter Cronkite era at CBS News?
It was an era in which the stars of news were wonderful writers and wonderful broadcasters, and he sat there at the top of the pyramid, representing the authority and credibility of news at a time when it really needed it. Everybody watched the evening news then, so he was the focal point of an entire nation during a critical time, during Vietnam. Not just the moon landing, but you remember that he was there when the streets were rioting. He was at the Chicago Convention. So his authority and his calmness held the nation together. Not forget CBS News. He held the nation together during critical times.
Did CBS make a mistake by making him retire at 65?
Well, that was a difficult time. I mean, ABC was chasing Dan Rather, and so there was some anxiety that Walter would eventually retire in the next 3 or 4 years, and Dan Rather would have time to build his reputation at ABC News. And Walter saw the logic of it, which is why he agreed. If Walter had not agreed, nobody would have dared take him off the air. I mean, his last week he had a 29 share. He could have got a 29 share reading the phone book. and I told him that once. So I think it was tough for him. If I was Walter Cronkite, I'd say, oh, I would have done that for 5 more years. Yeah.
What will his legacy be?
The sum of his experiences as a reporter, as a broadcaster, all sort of coagulated into that vision of the anchorman that no one can really surpass. I mean, you say that when people die, but the truth is, there was nothing between him and the audience. No screen, no camera lens, no nothing. He was in the living room. That's a skill that nature bestows along with experience. Very hard to duplicate. Hundreds of anchormen have done that. Women and men sat there and read a prompter and never been able to quite exude the authority, the calmness, the credibility, and the ease of persona as Walter did. He's a remarkable man. Remarkable.
As we've seen throughout the morning, no story excited Walter Cronkite more than spaceflight, which is why we thought this would be the right time to ask what those who share that enthusiasm have to look forward to now. Mark Strassman explores the answers.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
When men first walked on the moon, 500 million people, 1/6 of the Earth's population, watched in awe. For 2 hours, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin explored the lunar landscape.
Tell me if you got a picture, Houston. Well, we got a beautiful picture, Neil.
40 years later, Aldrin remembers it vividly.
It's not beautiful. It's magnificent desolation. Magnificent achievement for humanity.
That achievement provided the raw material for research that continues today in this rarely seen NASA lab. Behind this steel vault door, moon rocks. The building blocks of our solar system, older than rocks on Earth. Snapshots of how and when planets and moons were formed. Gary Lofgren is NASA's lunar curator.
And when they found out this rock was 3.9 billion years, that was a big deal.
Since the Apollo days when this control room came alive, NASA has come a long way. But its mission today is less clear. Is it the moon, Mars, and should humans go at all? NASA believes the moon is the crucial next step. Its mandate, return people there by 2020.
We have ignition.
This time, 2 rockets would launch to carry heavier loads, one carrying astronauts, the other cargo. In low Earth orbit, the capsule carrying the astronauts and the lunar lander would dock. After 4 days of travel, all 4 astronauts would land on the moon. For a week, they would try to learn whether it's possible to live off the land in space. For instance, the moon's poles may contain ice, a possible source of water, oxygen, and hydrogen. Their spacesuits attached to the exterior of the lunar rover. From inside, astronauts could step in or step out of their suits. Jeff Hanley leads NASA's new system of spacecraft called Constellation.
We're trying to go anywhere. We're trying to stay twice as long with twice as many people.
But critics, including the second man on the moon, say NASA must go to places people have never gone before.
That's a little bit different than Neil and Buzz kicking up dust on the moon. I think we owe them something more than that.
Tell me if you got a picture.
Ultimately, America has to make hard choices about how much risk to take and how much we're willing to spend. Just a trip to the moon would cost an estimated $100 billion. As once again, NASA makes the case for space and the next giant leap for man.
Whatever price the communists paid for this offensive.
Next.
We knew it was a chance we were taking and a violation of all the rules of the game.
In his own words, and later,
he was just dedicated to news. He really cared.
The world remembers.
It's Sunday morning on CBS, and here again is Anthony Mason.
Well, you've heard a lot about Walter Cronkite this morning from his friends and colleagues and admirers. Time now to hear Walter Cronkite's story in his own words, as told a while back to our own Charles Osgood.
About a decade ago, I spent an afternoon chatting with Walter Cronkite about his just-published autobiography.
Thank you very much.
A chance to learn a little about the man we'd all spent so much time watching on TV.
Your dad was a dentist.
My dad was a dentist. My grandfather was a dentist. My uncle was a dentist.
And you decided to be the first in a long line of dentists to do something else.
Yeah. I thought I'd rather look in the horse's mouth and get the truth rather than people's mouths.
General, was it these underwater obstacles that made Omaha the toughest of the beaches, as it was?
Well, of course, that was one part of it, but this...
Only hot war we've got running at the moment is, of course, the one in Vietnam.
I don't think that unless a greater effort is made by the government to win popular support...
You always refer to yourself as this reporter. When did you know in your life that that is what you wanted to be?
Very early on. I was directed into journalism, if you please, by a series of short stories in American Boy magazine. And the one that hit me most intriguingly was that of the newspaper man.
As for so many of the pioneers of television, World War II gave Cronkite his biggest break, the chance to report under fire.
I'm just back from the biggest assignment that any American reporter could have so far in this war.
I was one of them who volunteered to be frontline correspondent, to be out there where the shot and shell was. I made a few air missions. I was there a lot of the time.
The planes and gliders will split into two routes, northern and southern. Otherwise, the column will string so long, enemy fighters will be able to get up in time to attack the rear, or be so wide that flak can hardly miss. It is a day this reporter cannot forget.
Those American Waco gliders were built of aluminum tubing with canvas skins. The canvas cover beat against the aluminum, and it was like being inside the drum at a Grateful Dead concert. Over the drop zone, the second surprise. The tow rope was dropped, and down we went. No glide, a plunge almost straight down. The dirt came pouring in, our helmets went flying off.
This is the largest troop carrier operation undertaken by the U.S. Army Air Forces.
Cronkite was there on D-Day in June of 1944 when the Allies swept across the English Channel into France and began to turn the war around. Later, he did a tour in Moscow as a wire service reporter, and then came home to discover television.
Hello, everyone. Here we are again in Studio A, our CBS television control point for the Westinghouse coverage, this time of the
With his
Democratic
characteristic
National
modesty,
Convention.
Cronkite always attributed his success in television to his simply having gotten there first. And he had no reservations about the potential of the new medium.
Good evening from the CBS News Control Center in New York.
Cronkite claimed the anchor chair of the CBS Evening News in 1962. His coverage of the Kennedy assassination and of the Apollo program were touchstones of the age. His reputation continued to grow into the 1970s as he explained the Watergate story to the troubled nation.
When Liddy refused to answer FBI questions, he was fired too.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
He even had a hand in the Middle East peace process by engaging first Anwar Sadat.
How soon are you prepared to go?
In the earliest time. Let us sit together around the table and talk peace.
And then Menachem Begin, through a series of satellite interviews, to agree to meet face to face. And the Camp David Accords were born.
This business about being the most trusted man in America, I mean, the poll after poll was taken. It always worked out the same way. Why do you think that happened?
I really do think it's mostly because I was the face hanging out there of CBS News. CBS News had established such a reputation, such a dominant reputation by the time we were getting into television news and I was the anchor person, that I think that all of that history of performance by CBS News, trustworthy news presentation, rubbed off on me.
After all that, it may sound hard to believe that Walter Cronkite was once discouraged from getting into broadcasting in the first place.
Tell me about Harfield Whedon.
He was my first boss, in a sense. He was program manager of the station in Austin, Texas, where as a student at the university, I auditioned for the announcer's job, and Harfield rejected me practically out of hand with the immortal words, "Walter, you'll never make a radio announcer."
This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Good evening, President
Happily,
Reagan.
Cronkite ignored that bit of advice, and he went on to interview president after president. He says that the one he knew best was Lyndon Johnson.
I'd known him for a very long time. I had met him when he came to the Texas legislature, and I was covering that way back when.
Whatever price the communists paid for this offensive, the price to the Allied cause was high.
It is said that when Lyndon Johnson saw some of your reporting from Vietnam, he told whoever was watching with him that if we've lost Walter, we've lost America.
Well, what he saw was a aberration. The only time in my whole nearly 20 years of CBS Evening News anchoring did I ever give a personal opinion. There was a vast exaggeration of our successes out there, and we decided that maybe a little guidance might be helpful, a little personal opinion. And we knew it was a chance we were taking and a violation of all the rules of the game.
But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate.
Did he ever take you to task for that later? I know you got to know him well.
You know, never personally, but he, by indirection, did. We have it on tape, and it was part of the program when I did his memoirs later on. He said, and you know, the Tet offensive, people came out of the woodwork.
Because immediately the voices just came out of the holes in the wall and said, let's get out. And that's what Ho Chi Minh had been trying to do all the time.
Kind of looked at me, people came out of the woodwork and criticized our offensive, which obviously was a little bit of finger shaking right under my nose, but without naming me specifically.
More than once, Walter, it was suggested to you that you should have run for office and indeed possibly run for president. Were you ever tempted to do that?
No, I was never tempted. And I hope the day never comes when a nationally prominent anchor person or reporter on the air is tempted to run. Because if that ever happens, the public will have every right to question every other news person on the air as to whether they have in the back of their mind political objectives and therefore are skewing the news to build a platform for some time in the future. And that would be a terribly dangerous situation, just one more nail in our coffin of believability.
Talked a lot about responsibility and what a reporter should do. This business is also fun, isn't it? But did you not enjoy all these years of being a reporter?
Oh my gosh, enjoyed immensely. I went to work every morning, absolutely delighted to get there. I could hardly wait to get there.
Walter Cronkite was the public face of CBS News for decades, and he remains a source of pride for all of us at CBS to this day. Here with some personal thoughts about that is CBS President and CEO Leslie Moonves.
Many years ago, when I first became president of the CBS television network, my secretary buzzed me, and she said, "Walter Cronkite is on the phone." I was thrilled. I knew I had finally arrived. I was talking to a legend. I was talking to Babe Ruth. For many years, on the 19th floor of BlackRock, CBS's headquarters in New York City, Walter and I shared a floor. A couple of times a month, he would walk down to my office, or I would walk down to his, and we'd talk about the network news, the network, life in general. What a great guy. There's a reason Walter Cronkite was the most trusted man in America. He had honor, he had integrity, and when he spoke, people believed him and they listened to him. I am so proud that Walter Cronkite represented the CBS family. He was the best America had to offer, and I'm so proud to have known him. My friend George Clooney and I have been emailing the last couple days. George and his father Nick were very close to Walter. George's last email was, "I don't want to live in a world without Walter Cronkite." Amen.
Thoughts from Leslie Moonves, President and CEO of CBS. As you can imagine, for all of us here at CBS News who've worked in the studios over on West 57th Street in Manhattan for the past 5 decades, Walter Cronkite cast a giant shadow. I'm joined by Harry Smith this morning. Harry, whenever Walter would come back into this building, even in his later years, there'd be a huge buzz in this place. He was an extraordinary presence, wasn't he?
And especially for me, because I remember as a kid, like a lot of other people in America, in my house, my father would come home from a job driving truck all day, sit down with the Chicago Daily News and watch Walter Cronkite. It was almost like a sacrament. And when the news was finished and Walter Cronkite would say, "And that's the way it is," my mother would pop into the room and we could finally sit down and eat dinner.
Great story. Harry, while we have you, what's ahead on Face the Nation?
We're going to talk about health care this morning. We've got Charles Rangel and Orrin Hatch, and then on the back half of the show, more remembrances of Walter Cronkite with John Glenn, Bob Schieffer, and historian Doug Brinkley.
Harry Smith, thanks. And ahead now, here on Sunday Morning.
They didn't call Walter the most trusted man in America for nothing.
Singing his praises. The headlines say it all. Walter Cronkite's death has touched millions of people, both within the news business and without. Many have spoken of their admiration for America's anchorman. We want to take a few minutes now to share some of their thoughts with you, beginning with President Obama.
In an industry of icons, Walter set the standard by which all others have been judged. He was there through wars and riots, marches and milestones, calmly telling us what we needed to know.
Good evening.
He was an anchor in every sense of the word. He kind of put things together, made sense of this crazy world around us.
And you've got to do your damnedest to give your very, very best to prove to Walter that you belonged as a correspondent for CBS News.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
He handled it as a human being first and an anchorman second. And I think in times like that, that's what you want.
Walter Cronkite was the person who connected us all on that day.
Walter became not only everybody's anchorman, he was everybody's minister, priest, and rabbi. He calmed America down.
You really needed a voice of calm and professionalism and accuracy. And America got that on the evening news with Walter Cronkite.
And I think that the day President Kennedy died was the day that television news, as we now know it, was born for all intents and purposes. And Walter Cronkite was a very important part of making it so. It established that when momentous events occur and the country is deeply shaken, they gather at the television set. That is sort of the national meeting place.
This evening we tell the story of America's biggest civil rights demonstration. How it began, how it went, what it accomplished.
He changed the history of the war overnight because it was, for that time period in general, a young person's protest. And it became everyone else's wrong war at that point.
Here was the most trusted man in America saying this war is not right.
It is remarkable that one anchorman, one reporter, one journalist, whatever, could really affect the political fate of the country. But they didn't call Walter the most trusted man in America for nothing.
The other side of the man is if you see him on a boat, get the other side of him. There's something kind of, he's an explorer on that level. And I think that's why he loves the ocean and being at sea and all of it.
10, 9, ignition sequence start.
Oh, it's terrific. The planet is shaking. Look at that rocket go into the clouds at 3,000 feet.
There was no way of holding Walter back on space. Walter Cronkite thought of himself as another astronaut.
I'm Anthony Mason. A reminder that CBS News is presenting a one-hour special about Walter Cronkite tonight at 7 p.m., 6 Central. And we hope you'll join Charles Osgood back here next Sunday morning.